Hi, I'm Dr. Schaus. Welcome to Environmental Studies 106, Humans, the Environment, and Sustainability. I'm going to be giving an introduction to some of the topics we're looking at in this chapter, including environmental science versus environmental studies, the scientific method, how environmental problem solving is different. And we're going to give some foundational principles. Then in the second video, I'm including the root causes of environmental problems, worldviews, environmental ethics, and things like that. And I do this to chunk it down to about a 10 or 15 minute video, no more than 20-minute video for each section, just to keep the students engaged. All right, environmental science and environmental studies sound the same, but they're completely different. They're interrelated, but they are different. So environmental science differs in that the primary focus is on gaining new knowledge. It's a scientific approach. It seeks to understand it rather than trying to necessarily solve a problem. So it's the foundation for solving environmental problems, but it by itself does not. In contrast, environmental studies is more interdisciplinary. It relies on science, but it also needs an understanding of economics. It needs an understanding of laws and political systems and things like that in order to be able to really understand and solve an environmental problem. Environmental science uses the scientific method, and this is a systematic process of gaining new knowledge that then can help us understand environmental systems. So the way that this works is we make observations of the natural world, and from those we come up with hypotheses or educated guesses on what we think are going to happen, and then we do some sort of test to that. Now, it might be an additional series of systematic observations, or it might be an experiment where we change or manipulate something. In that case, we would compare the control group that's unmanipulated to the experimental group that has been changed or manipulated. And we usually repeat it multiple times in order to really solidify our understanding. From the results, we then gain an answer that will then tell us, how the system works, how the environmental case works. So let's take the example that's on the screen right now. Along the top muscle that's shown here, just to the right of the quarter, are a bunch of tiny little muscles called zebra mussels, and these invaded the Great Lakes of North America in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and then spread dramatically throughout that area, encrusting rocks and pier pilings and water intake valves for cooling of power plants, and they covered up native mussels. So a question was, are these having a negative effect on the native clams and mussels that live there? And so Dave Berg did an experiment whereby he manipulated whether there were zebra mussels or not zebra mussels, and then kept these mussels alive in cages. Same water, same situation, same length of time, some cages with zebra mussels attached to the native mussels and some without. And in the case that had zebra mussels, there was a lot higher mortality rate. And then that basically indicated, because there was a reliable and consistent increase in mortality, that this invader was a threat to native biodiversity. Another approach is the comparative approach. So you can do an experiment or you can make a systematic comparison. Bob MacArthur did this study of warblers in the New England woods and compared 5 different species that live there. Ecological theory would predict that if there are 2 species that have the same niche, they're then going to outcompete each other for resources. And so he wondered, why are 5 able to live there if 2 of them that are basically looking the same, except for different colored feathers, how are they able to avoid competition? So he did a series of systematic observations over a few summers and found that different species resided in different parts on the tree. Cape May warbler, tippy top of the tree, outer branches, feeding on the insects there. Yellow-rumped warbler, at the bottom and the middle of the tree. So they were not feeding on the same sort of resources. And the other species then utilized different places, as this graph indicates. An experimental approach would be to change or manipulate the system. So this was a study that Bob Payne did in the Rocky Intertidal of the state of Washington. And in that area, lower down in the intertidal, usually you have sea stars and other marine predators. And so, but they can only get a certain height in the intertidal before they dry out. And so he observed that there was a lot of biodiversity, lots of different organisms that live in that area, including acorn barnacles, which are the small little dot looking ones, gooseneck barnacles, which are the lighter colored longer ones, mussels, different types of seaweed, all sorts of different species lived in that particular area. And he thought that a predator might potentially be influencing biodiversity in that area. So in a small stretch of beach, he kept one area as it was, and in another area, he basically manipulated it by going down at low tide, grabbing all of the sea stars and throwing them out into the ocean. So they weren't killed, they weren't harmed, they were just moved to a different habitat, and they had to go find food there. And then he watched and surveyed those areas. In the area where the sea stars were present, the control area, there was high biodiversity, 15 or so species of different animals and plants and things like that directly attached to the rocks. In contrast, in the areas where the sea stars were removed, the blue mussels started to take over and the gooseneck barnacles. And over time, those were the only two species that were left in the plots where he went down regularly and removed the predator. So this would indicate that predators are really important in maintaining biodiversity and a wide variety of different living things in an area. So for the advantages and disadvantages of these, scientific inquiry gives us new knowledge. It's able to be objective. It can then apply a causal link, like with the sea stars. Only in the plot where the sea stars were removed did the system change. And so he understood that the predator was important in maintaining biodiversity. So this is our foundation for understanding. And then science is falsifiable. As we gain new knowledge, we gain a better understanding of what's happening in the system. And then we have a better idea of how the system works and what's going on in that particular system. So it adapts to new findings. Limitations, experimentation is not always possible. You might not be able to change or manipulate the system, and systems are complex. Sometimes science works by, let's just focus on one thing, let's manipulate the predators. Well, there's lots of species and lots of interactions, so you have to do a lot of experiments to really understand how the system works. So it's reductive in that it isolates. We're just going to look at this part of the system. We're just going to manipulate one. It can't really be hurried, and it can't really address value-laden questions. So questions where human values then have an impact on what's going on within the system. In contrast, environmental problem solving works to try to solve problems. It's not just gaining new knowledge. It identifies and diagnoses a problem. Maybe there are too many algae blooms in the Elizabeth River, and we need to figure out a way to reduce the amount of harmful algae blooms. So we might identify that as a problem based on water measurements. We might set some goals and objectives. We might design a study. We might set out some different ways to solve the problem. Maybe try to get people to not fertilize their lawn as much. Maybe get people to pick up the dog poop more often. Maybe the solution is putting more oyster reefs, because the oysters will filter the water and remove the algae from the water. So you can suggest different things and then implement those, monitor, and then see how is this improving, what needs to be happening. And so right behind where my face is on there, it's aiming ultimately as a solution. How do we solve the problem? So science is to gain new knowledge. It's objective, it's value free. You have to question and retest, and it tries to be deliberate and thorough. Environmental problem solving is trying to solve problems. So it does consider human values. How much is it going to cost to clean up the Chesapeake Bay? Is that an economic cost that we're willing to pay? You might need to continually monitor the situation, and sometimes we have to proceed before we know all the answers. And so that's sometimes people will see that as a drawback. Environmental studies has inputs from a lot of different disciplines, from different natural science disciplines, ecology, biology, chemistry, geology, different social science disciplines, politics, economics, law, psychology, sociology, as well as the humanities, ethical decisions, philosophy, religious studies. All of these things can potentially factor into our understanding of environmental studies. We tend to look at this, and this course is named what it is because it's humans, the environment, and sustainability. We're aiming at a sustainable worldview and a sustainable perspective where our activities can be maintained over a long period of time. But we're specifically looking at that interaction between the social system and the ecosystem. So the ecosystem includes the plants, the animals, the microorganisms, water, air, soil. Depending on how you view the system, it may or may not include human-built structures, but human-built structures certainly impact the systems. These then provide energy, materials, natural resources for our society. Our society is built on our population, our technology, our knowledge, values, and our social organization. And depending on the laws that we write, depending on the activities we have, these human activities then can impact the ecosystems as well. So a good example of this is in the late 1980s and early 1990s, we had a problem that we identified is that catching tuna for little cans of tuna or for tuna steaks that you would get at the market often caused mortality in dolphins. And people thought dolphins were cute and they wanted to keep them alive. And so they thought, this is a problem. This is wrong. We shouldn't be killing the dolphins. And the reason that they were killing the dolphins is a lot of the times dolphins are trying to catch the same food that we're trying to catch. So fishermen would notice, oh, there's a pod of dolphins. I bet there's some tuna underneath. And they'd set their nets in a circle around the pods of dolphins. And then they would catch the tuna, and they would also catch some dolphins. So they came up with ways of putting divers in the water and putting down the nets and trying to get the dolphins out of there. But ultimately, not all even though dolphins are smart, they couldn't always figure out a way out of the net because they didn't have to deal with nets on a regular basis. So there was negative effect on these dolphins. So this information then reached the public, and the public called for a ban on the tuna industry. Don't buy canned tuna because it causes dolphin mortality. Conservation organizations let the public know. Public then lobbied the government, and so they passed a law that you couldn't set the nets around the pods of dolphins, and that they set up a system whereby they would have observers on the fisheries that could certify that this is dolphin safe tuna, and you could only display the dolphin safe tuna label if you agreed to have an observer that was independent and they certified that you weren't out there killing dolphins. And so this affected the way that fishermen would fish, it affected technology, it affected fishing activities, but ultimately people then came to trust the new system, and it resulted in lower dolphin deaths as a result. Same sort of thing with other types of fishing. There's a lot of instances of what we call bycatch. So even on a hook and line fishing, whereby a long line is set out, and maybe every 3 feet there are hooks, baited hooks that can potentially catch fish. Well, this is good if you're a fisherman. You want to catch lots and lots of fish, but what they noticed is that sometimes the marine birds would then dive in to grab the bait, get caught by the hook, and then get dragged underneath and drowned. And the fishermen didn't want that. They didn't want to be killing birds unnecessarily, and likewise the general public didn't want that. So they devised a setup whereby the hooks are basically covered down a little bit into the water to reduce the amount of birds that were diving after the hooks, in order to reduce the mortality of albatrosses and other marine birds, and basically protect these vulnerable species. Okay, the last thing that I want you to do for this section is we're going to be working on a worksheet on important environmental problems. If you missed the first day's class, I'm going to do a makeup session Wednesday morning, probably about 10 o'clock in the morning, and I will announce this in class and let you know what the time is, but this will allow you to make up that time and have the access to that discussion, because it's a really important discussion that kind of sets a stage for the remaining stuff. Okay, thanks.